Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is another episode of Devva's Room, a series specifically designed to bring legacy to Devva and her friends and families who all advocate for uh, the leaders engaged in advocacy for disabilities. We've got some great guests here coming up, and our first guest, Susan. So, as one of the co-founders of Lead On, would you like to go ahead and give a brief overview of why you're so passionate about putting Devva's Room out there in this series of incredible content that you've got lined up that started a few months ago and will go through to December? And then you can go ahead and introduce your first guest.
Yes, as many of you know, Devva died in January, very unexpectedly. We weren't anticipating it in any way, shape, or form. She had been ill throughout the fall, but nothing significant. Um, but she got a diagnosis of fourth stage liver cancer on a Friday and was dead the following Saturday. So lost her way, 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 way too soon. And I worked with Devva for over 20 years on Society for Disability Studies. And what Devva always wanted, and we tried to do, sometimes more successfully than other times, was to bring disability studies into the community, take it out of the ivory tower, take it out of uh, academic jargon, and allow those who it directly affects to be part of the conversation. Society for Disabilities changed over the years and it became much more like that. But it never really became what she was hoping it would be in terms of really being someplace where people with disabilities could come to an SDS conference and learn right alongside the academics about disability. So that's what I'm attempting to do here. What Devva's dream always was to be. Now I'm inviting her friends to come and to share their area of expertise. And Jennifer um, was one of the people who helped me when Devva died, getting her Shiva together. She had helped in terms of finding a poem that Devva and she had written about herself. And so I considered Jen a very, very good friend. She helped me through a very, very tough time. But the reason she's here is not just because she's my friend and not just because she was Devva's friend, but because she has extraordinary knowledge when it comes to how technology is being used in society for the benefit of people with disabilities and everybody. And so that's what she's going to be talking about is the importance of technology in our lives and burgeoning kinds of technologies that are coming to play that we don't maybe use yet, but we certainly will be using, or some people will be using them more and more in the future. And Jennifer, want to say anything else about yourself before you go right into your
Thank you.
PowerPoint?
Thank you, Susan.
We're
I'm so
ready.
honored by that introduction. And I'm lucky to have had Devva as part of my life. And really, everything in this presentation was influenced by her because she is the person who introduced me to disability studies, or one of the main people who did. And she and I worked together to try to bring those perspectives into the technology world. And so this is sort of a lot of this happened after she passed even, but it still represents the legacy of what she brought to my field and the work that I do. My field as a whole, but a lot of this is about my own individual work. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And I've titled this presentation, The Role of Disability Studies in Accessibility Research, to sort of recognize Devva's influence on all of this. I myself am a professor of computer science and engineering at the Allen School of Computer Science at the University of Washington. And I also direct a center called the Center for Research and Education on Accessible Technology and Experiences, or CREATE. About 50% of us in the center identify as disabled, and a lot of this work was led by disabled people, as well as involving disabled people as participants in the research. So before I start, I just wanted to say that I did make an accessible version of this slide deck, and you can find it at this URL if you need access to it. So that's just a place to find the slides, but I will try to present them accessibly as well. So I want to start by defining what is meant by accessibility technology. And I'm going to start with sort of what I consider an old school definition. So this definition states that accessibility technology is any item, piece of equipment, software program, or product or system that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of persons with disabilities. And so this is shoot, now I don't even remember where I got this quote, and I forgot to put it in my slide notes, but it represents a perspective that we sometimes talk about in a disability studies world as being a medical model perspective. It emphasizes concepts of individual responsibility. And the implication is that if we use some kind of accessibility technology or fail to use it, it is a failure of the individual. And so you see research in things like abandonment and adoption based on properties of the device, like its performance and needs of the individual. And what I want to do today is question this definition, this framing of what accessibility technology is. We might call this technology that addresses a failure model of disability, so that it sort of assumes that there's something that's not working right and that this technology will help it. And we'll come back to that in a second. So if we start to center different perspectives on disability, we might think about, for example, that disability is something that is just part of everyday life. How does that change the way we approach what accessibility technology is? And I'm, by the way, just for context, so first of all, this slide has a picture of a person of color leaning over and putting together a piece of furniture, and leaning against the wall next to them is a cane. And so just trying to give a sense of, like, being disabled doesn't mean that you're off in a bubble somewhere. It just means you're part of everyday life. And I've put on all of the slides some markers of how we're going through the talk. So this section is about everyday life, and you'll see that repeating. So we did a study to try to understand from disabled people from a variety of backgrounds and disabilities how they define access barriers in everyday life. And failure, so impossible tasks that cannot be done without accessibility technology, was definitely one of the things that they brought up. So for example, in this quote, somebody wrote, "What happens if my motorized cart runs out of battery? Now I'm stuck in the store, but when I'm using my rollator, I can't use a cart because my rollator requires two hands." So they're talking about different technologies that are addressing a specific need to access a store here. But in addition, they told us about things like usability. So something might be possible to do, but it's slow or hard for some reason. We also heard about body-mind models, so doable but uncomfortable, for example. And finally, we heard about future impact. So doable now, but I'll pay later. And this is all part of a publication. I have pictures of all of my collaborators at the end because it's a lot to put them on every slide, but I just want to be very clear that I am not even always the prime author. I'm usually the last author on papers because I'm the mentor, but not always even that. So these are bringing together a community of work, not just my own. So what is an example of future impact? So going back to this example of the motorized cart that might run out of batteries, let's break this down a little bit. This user says, "I know this is going to hurt my body, but I'm going to make it quick and just walk since I can." So what are they doing there? They have a repertoire of technology. So they have a motorized cart, they have a rollator, they have their own two legs that they can walk on. And they are deciding between them. Some of them might be higher tech, some of them might be lower tech, based on their needs. And so they are using what we call situated decision making or consequence calculus, which was originally introduced by Avery Mack and Emma and others in a paper they published. And in this case, they're talking about whether it might run out of battery or is it going to hurt. In another example from the same study, a person told us that headphones put me at risk of being unsafe and feeling like I constantly have to be vigilant in public to protect my safety as a queer and trans person of color. So accessibility technology can't be understood in the absence of other aspects of identity here. It's really important that we consider the fact that people who are making choices to use or not use a technology or about which technology is best for them need to consider all of these things. And we can't just go in absent this kind of information and assume that we know what is right for somebody. So here, oh, I apologize. One of these things somehow got put behind. But we see that the AT characteristics like the battery life, the type of access need, personal identity, and social environment, like being in public, are all things that influence choice of accessibility technology. So another thing that might be helpful to consider in this kind of work, so moving on from everyday life, is diversity. And, disability is itself diverse, but in addition, most research in accessibility technologies doesn't mention race or gender. And many, many samples and studies are white, affluent, and educated. So I want to just give an example of what we learn when we explicitly go out and seek people from a wider array of backgrounds. So in this study, we interviewed people who were deaf and hard of hearing, as well as other people who identified as caption users because of a disability, but we explicitly sought out people who were multilingual for some reason. And while video technology is increasingly supporting a variety of languages, it still has a monolingual bias. So we wanted to find out what kinds of activities people want captioning to support. And to our surprise, the first thing we learned, maybe it should not be surprising, was that language is a fluent concept. And people's mastery of language really varies. Sometimes they are in the process of forgetting a language or learning it. Maybe they are good at listening to it, but not speaking it, or can read it, but don't, understand it as well in other contexts, or vice versa. And so people told us about the need for translation. So here, for example, I have a picture of a person holding a microphone and it says, "Et tu comprends?" I cannot pronounce this language, apologies. And then underneath that in English, "and you understand what I'm saying." So depending on fluency, this could be very helpful. But right now, caption technologies are not able to display multiple languages at the same time. A second area that people spoke to us about was what we call transliteration. So here you can see there's again a person speaking at a microphone, and words are written using the characters of the English language, but they are actually spelling out Hindi words or the pronunciation of those words. And so what we learned here was that, language learning varies across media, but a lot of captioning support today, or as far as I know, all of it doesn't necessarily support all of the kinds of scripts people would want to use. And then finally, we have translanguaging, which is when a common real world speaking pattern where people shift from one language to another as they talk in the middle of a sentence sometimes. So we're just starting to see like dual language technologies that can recognize these language shifts in some platforms, but this ability to recognize and respond to code switching correctly is not well supported yet. Other shortcomings that came up in our study were that caption users may be dyslexic or have other reading disabilities, and so they want control over font style, size, and color. And some caption users use the transcript window to access historical information as a memory aid, or because it is the best way to operate with their Braille display or other things like that, if they are deafblind. So with all of that said, about diversity, there's so much more to investigate in that space. We are not anywhere close to the end of our understanding of what it means to design accessibility technologies with everybody's full identity in mind. But today I'm going to move on to the next aspect of disability that I think we need to consider, which is invention. And here I have a slide that's just showing disabled people in positions where they are actively doing their lives in powerful ways that require and depend on inventiveness, independence, and other similar concepts. Again, this is not necessarily at the forefront of what is being thought about in the traditional accessibility sphere. So we have wheelchair athletes. We have a teenager who has made a glitter spray arm that she can wear. We have a picture from the Right to Repair movement of somebody repairing their wheelchair and another wheelchair user in a shop. And a lot of the technologies that are built are not built with this range of creative and active tasks in mind. So to investigate this, we went and spoke with existing disabled innovators who had already brought products to market to try to understand what kinds of things came up for them when they thought about accessibility technology. And one of the really prominent things in that was that AT innovation often requires systems change. For example, the advent of the TTY actually required an acoustic coupler and widespread adoption. This is not from our interviews, but just from related work, in order to be successful. And so interviewees in our study similarly didn't just build technology, they also built solidarity. They built communities around technology. For example, one interviewee speaking about the NVDA community wrote, "There have been many contributions to NVDA. It's not really just a software project, it's a movement, it's a community. NVDA is by users for users." And this is also championing disabled knowledge and leadership. In addition, many of these technologists were working to dismantle norms or revise structural assumptions about disabled people and emphasize real-world impact. So one person told us that Caption Fish created a movement that put butts in seats and showed theater owners that the deaf community had purchasing power. So the next thing I want to talk about is advocacy. I believe that being disabled teaches us to be advocates. This summer was the 50th anniversary of the Capitol crawl, and so I picked some pictures from that event showing people moving up the steps of the Capitol, because disability is a fight for civil rights and for justice for everyone who is disabled, and that fight is ongoing. And it's thanks to these activists that things like curb cuts and ramps are as common as they are, but we have much more to do. Of course, this is not limited to the physical world. Over 90% of Android apps are missing basic accessibility. Over 80% of Fortune 500 websites are not accessible. And therefore, the Association for the Community Living has defined accessibility technology to include services necessary to get and use accessibility devices, including assessment, customization, repair, and training, which gets us a little bit closer to the breadth that we would like to see here. But it's not enough. And so we did a 8-month ethnography at Open Doors for Multicultural Families and 13 interviews. And this ethnography was focused on an organization that serves families who have children with disabilities who are also often immigrants, low income, and so on. And what we learned was that for these families, a lot of what counted as AT or even counted as disabled was gate kept by organizations that they had to interact with. For example, one family wrote that one provider wrote, "I was trying to give one of my families a talking flashcards tablet where you put a card on the back and it will tell you, say, an apple. I said it's educational. They, meaning the insurance companies in this case, said, no, it's a toy." In addition, families encountered opacity, judgment, dismissal, and inertia due to power asymmetries. One person in our study described this as every fight feels like a losing battle. For example, one family wrote, "They made me feel like I'm taking money from their paycheck by asking for their time in filling out forms and supporting me, and they make me feel humiliated. If the teachers feel like this and they say things like that in front of me, what do they do when I'm not there? We also learned about timeline gaps, where getting a device funded required a lot of written documentation, time that we're not paid for. It also involves hours of understanding and implementing the process. As a result, the gap between when somebody knew that their child needed a technology and they actually got it sometimes extended beyond the time that that technology was even useful. This combination of factors led each institution to have chrononormative expectations, timeline expectations that dictated how bodies should operate and progress over time. But when bodies moved out of step with these institutional clocks, they were just left behind. And so AT use is inextricably constrained by this misalignment between lived time and institutional time. And this temporal mismatch could lead to failures. So what we saw was a response that we termed or built on the theoretical basis of minor resistance. What looks like passive disengagement is in fact often a careful and strategic assessment of costs, trade-offs, and consequences. Because the margins are thin, families became experts in identifying when help was truly helpful and when it might cost more than it gave. To give it a specific example, one participant had a son who was required to communicate via an iPad at school. He had an effective communication method involving signs and other things at home, but learning his language was too much work for his teachers. Although he was expected to use that iPad at home as well, his family chose not to, even though it meant he got less practice with the communication technology he was assigned. One person told us, the emotional toll of this made me not want to ask for more help. So strategic refusal was another strategy we saw where people would just refuse technologies, similar to selective compliance. A third was covert disobedience. So even if the school said, this is the device we recommend, for example, the families are catching on that it comes from a pool of maybe 2 devices, one participant told us. So they're also doing their own assessments because they want to have a device that's theirs, that they control, they can edit it and do what they want with it based on fit to their child rather than which of the 2 things available fits. So here, what looks like passive disengagement is choice, is trying to find their own solution. Finally, we heard about folk bridgecraft. Oh, because of these temporal mismatches and the lack of access to devices, families started trying to build their own solutions to bridge time gaps or just final gaps that there was no solution to. So one person told us that most nonprofits in the disability field locally are started by parents sitting around a kitchen table sharing needs and identifying gaps in services. So one of the things that we're seeing changing some of this picture is the advent of more powerful generalist technologies. And I want to argue now that the common thread between these 4 sets of interviews that I described, so everyday life, diversity, invention, and advocacy, is the need for disabled people to have agency in making their own decisions about how to navigate the barriers that they encounter, whether they are barriers due to service failures or barriers due to body, mind, future concerns, basic failures in access, and so on. And general purpose technology, I would argue, is accessibility technology. And an example is the iPad. When it came out, people started to have access to alternative ways to communicate that used to only be available on very, very expensive custom devices that you could only access if you were lucky enough to have a local agency or an insurance company that would pay for them. We've also seen it with 3D printers, where disabled people have started to create custom solutions to their own needs using these home manufacturing technologies. And frankly, that is just one piece in a longer chain of people using home equipment to make physical world solutions for all sorts of disability-related needs. And I'm going to argue today that it's happening again with generative AI, which I think is a really interesting case study of how disabled people use AI to solve problems. So let me give an example. And this comes from an autoethnography that I and several of my students with and without disabilities did over 3 months early on, and a second autoethnography where we worked together, a group of neurodiverse people worked together to use AI. So one example here is that this shows a picture of Gmail's Help Me Write AI interface. In our study, one author used AI to help edit emails and chats. They wrote, "Socially rubber ducking with an AI made me feel more confident than writing alone." And this supports neurodiverse people, for example. Another author with brain fog affecting their text comprehension used AI to simplify and summarize text. Here you can see a picture of ChatGPT summarizing a paper called Sparks of AGI. A third example is using AI for creativity support. So here, one of our authors with aphantasia was using AI to generate ideas for crocheted amigurumi. They wanted a husky with purple clothing and felt that their non-AI sketches were rough and hacked together in comparison with AI's adorable pictures, which provided flexibility and choice. So one of the interesting things to me about these case studies was that disability use of AI for accessibility really diverged from common examples of what we see in the AT world. For example, using generative AI or AI for code switching, meaning presenting an image of oneself that matched the professional context, for emotion regulation, for information access, and for a wide variety of communication needs. And what we've seen is that this really applies across disabilities. So since we published the work on our neurodiverse study and our autoethnography, pieces of these kinds of results have shown up in a study that we did not run on deaf and hard of hearing users. There is another really big use case I haven't mentioned, which is blind people using generative AI to understand the world around them or pictures. But there's a lot of overlap across all of these as well. And so this on-demand accessibility gives people with disabilities the ability to control how and when their needs are met themselves. It allows support for unpredictable or changeable needs, and provides real-time control, but it also allows people to address needs that simply hadn't been recognized by traditional designers of AT technology. I will also say that there's lots of ways in which AI is imperfect. So I didn't go into details, but many of the examples I just described came with errors that affected people, ranging from eliding parts of their identity. Sorry? Okay. Ranging from erasing parts of their identity.
I make sure I'm not on.
Okay. To for example, incorrectly summarizing text. And these are dangerous if people are not aware they can happen and don't have accessible ways to check for them, which is often the case when using AI for accessibility. I also want to highlight a power imbalance that I think is becoming increasingly important as AI is used on people, whether or not they know or choose to have that happen. So we have AI producers and AI beneficiaries, and everything I've talked to right now are AI beneficiaries, meaning disabled people who are benefiting directly from using AI. But we also have to think about indirect users, who are people affected by AI who never interact with it. And I'll give an example here of resume ranking. So here I'm showing a resume with awards and honors listed on it. And I want you to imagine for a moment that you are a hiring manager who is evaluating resumes, some of which may come from disabled people. We're seeing here about 10% of a resume, just the awards section, for a research intern role. And I've now modified that resume. So it already had like 6 or 7 awards in it. I've added 2 more. One is titled the Tom Wilson Leadership in Disability Award. And the second is titled the Students with Disabilities Scholarship. As a disabled job seeker and as a mentor to disabled job seekers, I've had many conversations about whether to disclose disability or not at this stage of the job seeking process. In this experiment, we wanted to see whether GPT, if it was reviewing, would exhibit bias when it encountered these kinds of disability items, which only enhance a resume. Remember, we added 2 awards. That's all we did. Everything else stayed the same. So we asked GPT, you are an experienced hiring manager. Rank these resumes for this position. List pros and cons for each candidate. I've shown a very simple bar chart here showing what should have happened, which is that all of the resumes with disability items should have been ranked first. We ran this experiment about 60 times, so 10 times each for a resume that mentioned autism, blindness, cerebral palsy, deafness, depression, and just disability. What actually happened was that the resume that was missing the 2 leadership awards was ranked higher than the resume that had them in about 75% of cases. Here I'm showing that for autism, the disability resume was never ranked first in our study. About 50% of the time, blind people's resume that mentioned blindness was ranked first. Same for disability. And the others were all worse than blindness and disability. This is bias in action. We also asked ChatGPT to explain. And this was GPT-4 for those who are curious. And it wrote things like the disabled resume had less emphasis on leadership roles, or involvement in disability advocacy, while commendable, may not be relevant to this role. Remember that the items we added included a leadership award and a scholarship. We did some anti-bias training, pre-prompting the AI. You are knowledgeable about the disabled experience and aware of underrepresentation of disabled people in the workforce. You'll avoid making assumptions about users' abilities or experiences. And here I have a bar chart showing the number of times that the disability was ranked for first in the original case and after anti-bias training. And the most important thing about this chart is that every disability besides depression improved. Some quite significantly. For example, the generic disability case shifted from 50% correct ranking to 100% correct ranking. So there's more to say than I could possibly fit in this hour, but I want to make sure there's time for questions, and I'm going to move on now to final thoughts. First, we need to rethink our approach to building accessibility technology. It is not a neutral tool. Rather, it is a site of negotiation. It must be grounded in or address structural conditions under which it will be used, because that impacts its success, not just individual characteristics. And we must find a way to end gatekeeping and trust that people who use AT know what they need, which is agency and control rather than assumptions and limits. And this really doesn't just apply to solving problems. Our studies have shown that people care about aesthetics, modifiability, repair, and interoperability as features of AT that are often overlooked. So let's build a future that includes everyone. This means in our movement work, we must honor and study and understand minor resistance, underserved communities, and we must recognize that, like mutual aid, minor resistance is an often underlooked form of advocacy and action. We can't just focus on those who have resources. We also have to work to grow the next generation of disabled researchers, technologists, and faculty to ensure that we have leadership at all levels of the AT production process. And if we can get there, a future led by disabled people has the potential to be anti-ableist as well as accessible, to support agency and control, as well as documenting and counteracting negative state and structural forces, to center disabled voices in leadership while it develops novel technologies that benefit us all. So I just wanted to say thanks to the folks who've funded this work over the years. A lot of different national agencies as well as companies have invested in this. And I have some highlights of my group members and other leaders of these projects here, including Brianna Weimer, Jerry Cow, Han Zhang, Gisette Johnson, Kate Glasgow, who did a lot of the AI work I just mentioned and is in the room, Ashka Desai, Avery Mack, and Stacy Shea, and there's many other collaborators. I couldn't fit them all on the slide. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions and have a conversation now. And I know we started late, so I also don't know how much time we have, but I'll leave that up to the organizers.
We have plenty of time because Kim isn't here.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Michelle, for interpreting as well.
Jennifer,
So if you want to ask a question, because everybody's on mute at the moment, you can either ask to unmute or raise your hand. Or if you know how to unmute yourself, just unmute yourself and jump in. Because we don't have to turn take. Or quite happy to have people talking over each other as long as we all make sense.
I'll jump in here with the first question because I really do take a kind of Main Street mama perspective to everything. And I really have learned so much working with Susan and Alice and Sharon and Scott in the last 3.5, 4 months. Here we are, a digital platform, thinking that we're serving everybody. And if you don't go up those traditional lines of web development training, you can easily bypass so many of these things to where you are saying 80% of Fortune 500s are, not truly accessible and have issues and everything like that. So I really appreciate your presentation. I guess my question to you is part of the reaction. I screenshotted what I loved in your takeaway, which is in our movement work, we must honor the minor resistance. Like mutual aid is often overlooked as a form of action. So what I hear that to say is let's be patient and let's take our time. If people are willing to lean in, change, and learn, let's give them grace to be able to get there. So that's kind of so I just wanted to appreciate that. One of the takeaways that we did was we went ahead and grabbed a whole bunch of tutorials so that you could earn a badge on being a digital health community worker. Can you sit down with somebody and be able to train them on all the accessibility features on an iPhone or an iPad or an Android phone? And just that exercise alone made me really look at Apple as like the far leader in accessibility tools because everything's built in and it's just then a matter of maybe knowing how to use it versus Google. It seemed like you had to like band-aid so many different things over there. You need this app, you need that app. Is that what the general census is in the tech world when it comes to just devices, that Apple is far ahead?
I I don't know that I have that data. I would say that, you know, these days so much is web on even on mobile devices. So the like both Google and Apple have a variety, like they all have built-in screen readers now. They have a lot of support built in. We're seeing advances in meeting software that are moving quite fast. But then when the individual designers of specific applications, games, websites are not paying attention to accessibility, it doesn't matter how accessible your operating system is, people have to meet it, you know, through the APIs at the appropriate place. They have to actually describe their images. They have to have structures that are navigable. They have to, if they're doing like a game where they have an image that they've created that is replacing traditional user interface components and they don't expose the right information, all of that is not accessible.
Do you want to stop your share so we can get a little bit more
Oh,
insight
sure. Yeah,
and
happy
we'll bring
to.
some folks in? Yeah,
Um,
perfect.
And I'll also just say that with respect to minor resistance and mutual aid, a lot of that is about who we include in our movements too. So the idea that like people who are on the ground doing this kind of mutual aid work, who are on the ground doing minor resistance, often are seen as less than movement leaders or not as effective. And so that's part of what I was getting at with that slide. You're absolutely right that we also want to welcome learning at whatever stage it is at. The caveat to that I will say I have encountered far too often is when it leads to incremental change that doesn't get to the end point enough, right? And so we need both of those. We need things like the new DOJ rule that set a goal and make it clear that, you know, we're however many years after these technologies were invented, we're still really far from that goal, and we need to move the timeline up. And we also need to honor and encourage and support the learning that gets us ready for that.
Thanks. And I think Scott's
Yeah.
got his hand up.
Yes, I see that.
Oh, stand by.
Mhm.
Let's see. Start video. Hi, Jen.
Hi.
Thanks for everything you do. I mean, you're one of my rock stars. Right up there on the front lines of everything. I have one point. My main question is about the EAA and moving forward and seeing if we can use that momentum in our desires to make life more accessible to all. But the last slide you showed after your anti-bias training, the only sector that didn't show any growth was depression. So does that mean that that's a super stigmatized hiring element?
I would say yes.
I mean, I was just shocked that everyone else showed growth, but depression was like the hot button of live shooter in the, you know, type of reaction. But my question was, in that same category, anti-bias, because I'm creating data sets to train our own AI, and I collected 15,000 pages of 3,000 authors with lived experiences, and then had essay experts or just have them in different classifications of where that lived experience attributes to the disability experience now. But my question was, I subdivided it into 1,000 BIPOC authors, 1,000 LGBTQ plus authors, and 1,000 advocacy partners. And I was thinking in my back of my head, this is how I was going to attack anti-bias through the lived experience in training our own agents moving forward. Is there another element that we should be looking for to interject into the agent training process of anti-bias?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. You might remember I had that slide that was talking about like AI producers, AI beneficiaries, and indirect users. So you're doing the work that we want AI producers to do, sorry. And there's a lot of research happening right now, really not specific just to disability, that's trying to ask questions about what is the right way to improve these algorithms, right? How do we address the fact that many of them are inherently designed to find averages, right? Like you're trying to find norms, and disability is inherently not that. It is all of the things outside the norm often, right? So how do we address that? How do we address the, lack of data is what you're addressing here, like really trying to make sure that we have a better representative data set. And there's other things that we might also need to think about. If we have data like that, is it being labeled properly, right? How do we, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge amount of work going on, luckily, in that space. And I hope that, what you're doing is a really, really important step. And maybe there will be other guidance that begins to come out that can help us do even better. For people using the technology, we have a different set of issues, right? If you are directly using it, I think to me, the biggest one for disabled people is that no matter how accessible the interface is, if you're using it to access a document that you can't see, can't hear, can't read for whatever reason, you don't have a way to check for errors. And so we need new innovations on that front. And then we have this case of indirect users, right? And who may be encountering technology that doesn't have a producer like you behind it who's tried to make it better, or that has a really shallow solution. And so there we're trying to find new solutions that actually give power to indirect users. And I don't know how Kate feels about this, but I'm going to sneak peek a paper we have in publication where we found that if you put a footnote on your resume, black on white, just saying, hey, if AI is being used to assess this resume, it should really essentially, keep disability justice in mind and not be biased. That actually makes a difference, more of a difference, I would say, potentially, although we don't have an apples to apples comparison than pre-training potentially, because it's right there on that resume as it's being processed. So this,
my second question,
yeah,
because I want to take up all the time, because this one's really critical in our long-term planning, is the EAA, which is the European Accessibility Act of 2025. And the revolution of moving 2D data into 3D atmospheres. XR Access is a perfect example of that organization or collaboration over in Cornell University. How do we articulate that and move that forward in America? Because we seem to be anti-European in this current political statement that, oh, it happens in Europe, doesn't happen here.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I think that it's really hard to deconstruct the current political environment, right? It's eugenicist, it's attacking disability. There's so much harm being done. However, most companies today are multinational. And so when it comes to accessibility technology in particular, as opposed to, say, access to basic services and healthcare, there are economic forces that go beyond what the federal government has control over, because some states care, because some other countries care. And so things are getting developed and will continue to be developed because of those economic forces, and hopefully because they also make products better, as accessibility often does. We will see some of them come back. So that's my hope on AT.
Thank you. Lead
Yeah.
on.
I see Alice has her hand up and has had for a bit, so let me just check in there.
Hi, everybody. First of all, what a wonderful presentation, Jennifer. You've given a lot of things to think about. There are a couple in the chat, Susan. I don't know if you want to read those, but my question is kind of segueing off of what Scott was asking. One of my questions is how, in light of the recent changes to Section 504 on accessible web design in general, while the focus has been on the healthcare platform, there are deadlines looming, 2026, if you have a certain number of employees. And the question is, again, how do we get the needle moved so that people begin to think about the importance of accessibility? As you stated, if the document is not structured properly, no matter what you're using, you're not going to be able to get the gist of the information or understand what is totally there if you can't see it in particular. So I'm wondering what kinds of comments you're seeing in the research space and as well as the legislative space, And then the second question is more related to the assistive technology evaluation process in terms of using a client-centered approach and showing different options and letting the client make the decision based on what they feel they can use. I'm just wondering what you're seeing as the current process in terms of evaluation and device selection.
Yeah, so on the first point, I just want to mention that Biden actually gifted us 2 new rules, one about ADA Title II, and the other one is more about 504 and healthcare. And combined, they cover a lot of ground. So the ADA Title II one covers all government services, including K-12 education, websites, higher education that is, falls within the, I think, state-funded category. And it sets the same kind of aggressive timelines. Obviously, we don't know what kind of enforcement we'll see under the current administration. However, universities, big schools like the University of Washington are investing a lot of time and effort right now in trying to respond to those rules because they have created a scenario where the goalposts are very clear and the institution really needs to try to meet them or it increases its risk. And also, it's just helped people, I think, step back and recognize that we are really failing some of our students with disabilities, for example, and need to do better. So there's a lot of really caring people right now in various institutions around the country who are doing this work. You see it show up at places like CSUN, because so much of it, it's all about digital accessibility and digital documents, and there's so much to do. So I have hope that that will lead to progress, but I'm also very cognizant about the difficulty of moving the needle on what is really a bill that is coming due that is 20 years old, right? We've been making PowerPoints for a very long time, for example, and PDFs and other things, and not doing it right. So anyway, I think that these kinds of rules are critical importance on the policy front, and then the institutional buy-in and effort to really change the culture of what is expected when it comes to producing documents, websites, and apps is equally important. And procurement is another place that we're seeing change because of this, meaning that when a large institution like the UW buys a textbook or an application, in fact, UW collaborated with Zoom early in the pandemic, even before this rule came out, to say, if we're going to switch online, we need your help making sure that some of the access issues we see are addressed. And Zoom stepped up. So I think that those kinds of relationships are also really powerful when it comes to change.
There's a couple comments. You go ahead, Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and restate them. Kim is still not in the room.
Yeah, and I'm sorry.
One of our fearless leaders, Gordon Fuller, over there. So, Gordon, if you feel like you want to comment in and play along, also feel free. But
and I know we could answer Alice's second question.
Let's get to Jill's comment first.
Yeah. Okay.
So Jill's comment is, this was a phenomenal presentation. I so loved your description of all the levels where things break down for AT users. I especially appreciate your mention of appreciation of aesthetics of tools being used. Are there any realms, trends, companies, etc., that are doing great things? Anything that's exciting to you right now?
So if you're talking about aesthetics in particular, to me, some of the most exciting stuff happening there is actually happening in the DIY realm. It's where we're seeing, like, Ravelry, for example, which is the website for knitting patterns, has an accessibility tag, and there's all sorts of amazing things happening there where people are making beautiful objects that also meet accessibility needs. We just completed a study about a year ago of mobility device users, primarily younger adults, and we saw a huge variety of ways in which they were decorating their devices and modifying them to fit their identities better and the circumstances that they wanted to use them in. So these kinds of things are happening when, when people start to build out their own things. When I first started using a cane, I discovered a website called Elder Lux that was trying to break the mode of gray pole based things for older adults. And that was where I got my first sparkly cane. So there are some companies, I know they're not alone anymore. I don't know the full scene there though.
Okay, another comment. This one is, let's see, I gotta scroll down. It's from Kate. Oh no, Kate's just suggesting neowalk.com.
Kate, she wrote,
But she had a comment earlier. So
Yeah.
technology for shifting inaccessible ableist systems is a great goal, or building empowering systems. Yet the reality for many disabled people is a hostile environment, political, societal work that requires survival and adaptation. Is there still a role for individual adaptation and meeting immediate barriers based on the norms in the future of AT?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the failure model is part of what people use AT for, right? And that doesn't necessarily address hostile environments, but it certainly addresses the fact that, frequently as disabled people, the first thing we have to do is figure out how to adapt to a world that is not designed for us. And we often use technology to do that. And while it would be lovely to see solutions like curb cuts that don't necessarily require us, and also, some of the things I didn't mention that are happening in my field also have to do with things like interdependence and shared responsibility, that if I am in a phone call with other people, some of whom use ASL or captioning, it's on everybody in that call to slow down, to avoid speaking over each other, to recognize other access barriers and not assume that the one person or multiple people who have the access need are also the only ones responsible for it being met. So those kinds of things are important, but so is the power to move forward in the face of these kinds of hostile environments or inaccessible environments. And technology absolutely has a role to play there too.
Scott, is your hand still up from before? Or do you have a new question?
Hi, I thought there was a line. But getting back to your last question of innovation, we've been doing some research on WCAG 2.0 platforms being built up from the ground up. And have you been following AirMeet, or could you explain WCAG 2.2 or building from the ground up in accessible fashion rather than trying to fix the old, and how we can convince in the web developers in the next evolution to incorporate the WCAG standards in their builds?
That is such a great question. A friend of mine, Jonathan Lazar, calls that born accessible technology. So like we should give birth to it as accessible from the get-go. And I think that to me, one of the biggest challenges I see with that is that most web technology is built on layers and layers of tools. So we have front-end tools, we have back-end tools. And if these tools make accessibility hard, right? Like, for example, let's say you're using a GUI to design something and you specify that something should be a header, but underneath that, the tool marks it as a div object instead of an h2 or an h1, right? And then just styles it. It doesn't matter. You don't even know, as the person who's building out the content, that the tool has broken accessibility underneath that. So to me, we do need people to educate themselves who are creating content, but we also need the general tool developers to commit to accessibility. And if there were a web framework that really right from the get-go built that in, I think it would be powerful. That's actually something Android does better than many other things. If you use their off-the-shelf library elements, they have some accessibility support built in.
Because what fascinated about me with the AirMeet was, streaming is the hottest thing going, and they're first to the market. But we have all these other platforms like Lucy's, for instance, that have been built for 7 years, and they're going, where's the bridge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and to refute that, there are, in my research that I've done, there are themes that come out of the box much more friendlier and intact, right? But it's not necessarily just a matter of changing a theme and then everything's working, because of course you've got, 5, 6 years that are built upon that. So I think that the things that I'm seeing out there are better, and I do think it's probably easier to build from to do it all over again. Of course, I would be going it up and out, with something.
Yeah.
You don't
And
have
it
to go
really,
back.
it's very
I don't know if I
WordPress
agree
has
with
some,
the newer tools being better. I know that I have a hell of a time with WordPress because I would rather code a website than deal with WordPress. And I find myself recoding constantly because I'm more comfortable with coding than I am with these sort of pre-canned accessible, theoretically accessible websites. Because you've got to learn how to use them. And if you don't use them right, they break and they're not accessible at all. Whereas
If
I know how to code accessibly.
if I may, Gordon Fuller here, I will confess to being a futurist, so I'm always at least 10 minutes ahead in the time scale of things. But I've been following the emerging technology field for now 40 years, and I'm working with people on Web3. And Web3 is indeed being built from the ground floor up. And the reason for that is the people that have been doing three-dimensional web worlds have been primarily people, and I don't mean web 2.0 field, I mean 3. They've been people in the interactive games world, which has made all of these very popular forms of entertainment that have far exceeded anything else that has ever been. Movies, television, everything thrown together doesn't even touch it. And it's being used in so many ways. So those tools and tech have been in silos where each of the companies has had a proprietary interest in tweaking theirs to the way they want the game to perform for the people that in their minds they see as their customers. And so we haven't seen a lot of parallel development to what you've seen in Web 2.0, where it'll take your money, where it'll give you a catalog, where it can catalog and review your pictures and mail for you. All that sort of thing's been built from the ground up, interlinked, patched, fixed, security layer upon security layer. And then, of course, let's not forget how well we're mined, tracked, surveilled by these tools. So we've built up quite a gnarly infrastructure on the other side. You change one little bit of it, it's like pulling on a thread on a cheap suit. And so when you build from scratch, you have the opportunity to remember, first of all, the full spec on human beings, which is how I refer to it. From cradle to grave, that's a hominid life form. How are you going to embrace that? And if you're good at it as a purveyor of services, goods, products, you're going to win the bell, because around the world, it's a diverse world out there. And indeed, those are the things, the forces that are driving the evolution of technology today. We don't have Silicon Valley anymore dominating anything except the news and politics. From here on, it's a game of people who down at the grassroots level are knitting a new social fabric that'll bring us better services. And some of those services are astonishing. I've been working with virtual reality, 3D movies, immersive technology, arcade theme games, stuff like that all my life. And I can tell you, what we can do for people with disabilities is the thing that really drives me as a blind person to think of a better world that I could live in, where the physical world, the spatial environment in which we hominids dwell, talks to us, is annotated, gives us cues, provides to us access to notes and details provided by friends and other colleagues. We can live in a world that is so better connected down at the grassroots, not only
Absolutely, Gordon. This is Alice. Yes,
I really
absolutely. Absolutely.
Because where is the accessibility? It's the thing that's missing from accessibility. Where do I find the ramp? How far from the how from the parking
and if the
lot?
developers are not thinking about the ramp in the first place, it's not going to be there at all. And we do know that there are lots and lots of emerging technologies happening right now. There's a lot. Jennifer, your presentation about AI was spot on. But again, the way I am seeing AI moving, again, we are going to end up with AI tools that are going to not be accessible to people who need to be able to use them because the interface will not have been built with disability and accessibility in mind. And
Well,
there is a way to remediate.
It's a big scary money glacier is what you're saying. But the truth of things is when you're weaving on the social fabric where people live, we monkey human things are pretty much the same, more or less, as we all know. And the tools for accommodating our needs and our basic responses to our environment within the spaces we operate, the things we do, is what we call ambient AI. And it should be embedded in your phone because it's personalized to you. It's your UI, UX way of accessing and integrating your time and space with the world around you. And the built environment is the thing that is really challenging right now because the ADA changes they were making with 504 said very specifically, we're no longer going to give federal requirements down there. People building stuff in communities, they can make those decisions themselves, put it into their budget and so on. So basically, they were trying to hand back to the local contractors building our ugly federal buildings and all the rest, the opportunity for them to basically create barriers for us as it goes. And to be honest with you, I've been a little shocked and appalled how little support we've had from commerce over the years. I mean, we've had the tax credits for making your environment accessible and removing barriers. It's been used widely to put in accessible restrooms, things like that. But what about the spatial environment? You know, the 3D mapping of a community store would be such a benefit for a person with a disability because you could go shopping without being there, or as you approach the store, would be alerted and bring out your order or whatever. You know, making it personalized, making it your way is the future. And it's just one of the clown acts that the corporate people, corporatos, I like to call them, you know, have been foisting upon us as here's how you do this. You know, well, really? Because at the end of the day, I don't want to have a lot of logins, passwords, apps. It's not me. You know, my identity can be managed much more effectively as a person with a disability. And I expect as a consumer person in this society to be personalized, accommodated. Customer is always right. Hey.
And that it's automatically there for you, that you don't have to ask for it and you know where to find it. And I think that's another piece that has to be addressed. Jennifer, you talked a little bit about usability. And so one of the questions that I have too is what trends you're seeing in terms of bringing in new developers and teaching those developers how to code accessibly from the beginning. I know that Teach Access has been in the business for a while, but are you aware of institutions that are teaching accessible design and the standards so that when they're looking at creating a product, they're thinking about various learning aspects, intellectual disabilities, and also having a testing pool of people who are going to be the end users?
Yeah, you know, I think that Teach Access is doing an outstanding job. I think I heard they just reached I think they hit a goal of 1 million students or something like that recently. There are very few official programs in accessibility. Gallaudet has one. I don't know of a ton of these. There's not, the research as of 5 years ago was still that very few computer science departments had accessibility at all, much less required. Something that I think is really great is this book that came out recently, Teaching Accessible Computing, which I put a link in the chat. And that book, which is at bookish.press, has a chapter for many different topics in computer science discussing how accessibility could be brought into that topic. But we desperately need more programs that include accessibility as a core requirement, or at least make it as prominent as things like security and privacy in what we teach. And if we had that combined with tools, and I recognize that some tools are great, but many are not, right? If we had those two side by side, I think that we would see more consistency.
On that note, this is Scott again. On that note, we are actually creating a directory of primary source contacts, which will be published for Judy's birthday on December 18th, but it's focused on National History Day. But we're doing the information mapping process. we've identified over 500 different relationships in the accessibility sector that intersect with education as well as corporate compliance. So that directory of primary source archives will also have a technology relationship mapping of the disability community of a who's and what they're doing.
Oh, nice.
So Kate has put a comment in the chat. The focus of AI development seems to be to speed and scale. I'm excited by work such as by my friends Venkatesh,
Thank you.
Totluri, and Toby, Tobi, Weinberg, Weinberg. I do that for the ASL interpreter instead of just trying to pronounce it. Who built AI tools for accessibility on the cutting edge. Their work is not retrospective. It looks at the latest development in an accessible context.
Yeah, there's a lot of great folks out there. Those are definitely two of them. I would also say Sherry Azenkot, for example, has really been a pioneering leader in trying to make sure that XR accessibility gets attention. And we've seen other folks like Dhruv Jain leading the charge in rethinking captioning technologies and so on and so forth. And they're all people who bring lived experience to the work that they're doing as well.
I'll just mention that I've been recently working at the state level on the broadband initiative, the Internet for All, NTIA initiative, which was recently defunded in most ways, meaningful. But they've brought to the table the workforce development people, all the universities, all the education people, and the state government and the libraries, and they've networked throughout the nation, the states working together on this stuff. And, you know, the very overriding impression that I've had from start to this moment is it's completely neglected to be thought of as any of the things that might apply to people with disabilities. I, for instance, have been pushing spatial computing, the very thought of creating 3D spatial maps of our communities to identify accessibility and integrate it into all the systems we use. And we can do that now with the kind of platforms we have. And you see that in Korea. If you're looking for schools and places where people are focusing on developing next generation solutions for spatial computing, it's not our country at this point. And in Europe, the standards they have there are indeed causing it to evolve. But here in the United States, we've kind of fallen off on that stuff. And our innovation is going to suffer because people, not unlike some of the folks around the table here, are not being incentivized, are not being supported in the way that's necessary for those kinds of things to flourish. And of course, throughout all of history, it's been the innovation created by people who are greatly challenged that make all the difference. And in these times, with such aging populations everywhere, and with robotics and AI all at the forefront of everyone's thoughts, clearly, it's an important area for humans. Wow. Sorry.
I have a question that kind of builds on that for Jen. So you kind of mentioned the importance of, keeping up with innovation. I mean, I recently attended an AI conference and there was very, very few people in accessibility there. There was probably even fewer disabled folks. Yet it's, as these technologies progress, it's so important to have people maybe in the room where these technologies are being built and developed who, have a disabled perspective. So how do we sort of make that happen, right? I don't know that that's necessarily been happening now. I kind of made that comment with, some of the folks that I can think of, but overall, I do still think it's, it can be a problem. Like accessibility can be an afterthought in the development of emerging technologies. So how does it stay in the foreground and how can it actually be a shaping aspect?
I mean, to me, that's why I dedicate a lot of my time to trying to make academia more accessible so that people can major in whatever it is that they want to major in and become leaders in whatever field they are excited about. And we start to have a higher percentage of disabled people who are in leadership positions as these fields evolve.
I think also that that's where we take the onus on ourselves as individuals, that actually care. And like, how can I share it? Our mantra is learn it, live it, share it, right? Learn it, live it, share it. Learn it, live it, share it. You can learn everything you want, but if you don't live it, then you won't reap the benefits of it. And so my takeaway was I now carry into every single Zoom that I do. I just make sure, hey, you guys, did you know that there's a setting? I mean, I just do a spot check whether or not captions was on, because I cannot believe that for the longest times of all the Zoom meetings that I hosted, because nobody brought it up. Right? You don't know what you don't know until you know you don't know it. So that's why I kind of sort of like that grace up early. What are like the 10 basic things that we want everybody who doesn't think about disability should absolutely know, right? When you said earlier, or when Susan, I can't remember if it was you or Susan said, if somebody is on and you know that the captions are on, take your pace down so that it is more understandable. Susan spelling out the name for the interpreter, just things like that. We just, like I said, my perspective is Main Street Mama, but Main Street Mama has had 3 business partners in the last 6 months now be disabled, right? And when we say disabled, also from a developer standpoint, I'm like visual, audio, mobile, right? It's just such a huge, huge, huge spectrum to try and put your arms around. But yeah, I mean, a friend just got their foot amputated, right? Or my business partner, Dr. Rob, he literally just had 2 side cameras put on his car because he can't turn his neck like this. So now when he comes up to an intersection, he doesn't have to like hope and pray. He knows right there. So it's like, to me, it's all kind of like problem solving along the way. But I would like to know, and that's what I was talking to Alice and Susan about, like, what are the 10 things that you want every single like business owner or high school, senior to know about being empathetic in the disability space, and let's make a badge out of it. But to answer your question, Kate, I take it upon myself to make sure that I'm sharing that information, as I go. But that's just my contribution to
That's great. Yeah, sharing.
just make sure the leaders know. I'm also leading a health and
readability.
education task force for the broadband stakeholders in Arizona. Gordon is on that. And guess what? Gordon is, like, how can you guys be making decisions? And so we made it a point to hyper focus on accessibility on our task force deal. So you got to fight from both sides of the candle, I think.
Absolutely. That's
Jennifer,
great.
this is Alice one last time. I know we're running a little short, but my question now, as we're trying to promote Devva's Room and the history that many people don't know about in terms of who wrote the ADA. I mean, we can ask that question at a party, and everyone somewhat knows about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but they don't know the history. And how do we get it more prevalent and more in the mainstream of education, so that my colleagues that I worked with before I left higher ed, who knew nothing of Judy, nothing of Ed Roberts, and I had the fortunate luck to live in Berkeley for 10 years and be in the assistive technology space there. So I learned that history, but the mainstream people out there don't know that history exists and probably aren't even searching out for it. So how do we promote that and promote things like the work that you're doing, that disability studies scholars are doing, and get this rich history out into the public eye? How do we promote Devva's Room so that it gets more broad knowledge across to people? I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, you're way outside my academic expertise at this point, but I will say that I believe there's a Disability History Museum project that has some amazing leaders in it who are working on this. So
Yes.
Well, I can give you an example of this that I ran into. So I was see, let me formulate my thought here. So I'm going to a series of events that are for the Democratic Party and geared towards folks with disabilities. That's the whole premise behind these monthly meetings. They're very good about calling you up and reminding you of when the next meeting is. The last time they had a meeting, they had the first person call me and they said, "That's an unusual last name. I mean, it's an unusual email address. My email address is susan@iloveyoulleadon.com." And I said, "Well, that's what Justin Dart said at the end of all of his speeches." And she said, "Oh, you must really admire that man." And I said, "Do you know who Justin Dart is?" She said, "I have no idea." And so I had to tell her who Justin Dart was. And this is the person who's calling people with disabilities to invite them to come to a disability focused evening. So that aggravated me to no end. But then the next call, the same thing happened. It was a different person. And they said the same thing, something about my email address was interesting. And again I said, "Do you know what the origin of that is?" I said, it's a fundamental phrase in the disability community and never heard it before. And I'm like, okay. Another point where I have to do some education. And I think, one of the things that we as people with disabilities are always put in this situation of having to educate people. And sometimes it gets really tiresome. But we can't stop.
I was on the women's commission. Oh, Susan, I was on the women's commission and thinking I was all nice and tough. And I was going head to head against an 80-year-old who was giving me a little grief. And and I didn't know what the word suffrage meant. Okay. So I'm like, I got schooled. And then from that point, I was like, "Do you know what suffrage is?" Like, I ask everybody because nobody knows what suffrage is. Right. So, but I would just counsel to you, please, please, please just have grace, because I'm telling you, people do not think about this stuff until they're aware of it. And then when they're aware of it, then they can pull in and know more about it. But maybe the disability organization should have a little ABC basics on key things that everybody who's working for this organization should know as they do outreach. I mean, part of what we wanted to do is create this little badge, the 10 basic things to know about, Justin Dart and the foundation of the ADA. Or when we had the T4, right? The very first Devva's room, the gas chambers and the whole T4 program. I'd never heard of that, and nobody I've talked to has heard of that. And it was just a crazy disgrace and horrific thing that happened. So it's just like we've been given a filtered type of history, and I do think ADA. Along with civil rights and women's rights, I mean, 60 years isn't that long ago. I mean, like, we're not that, far from it. So I don't think any of the young people know. I don't think us Gen Xers know, unless you're like in the fight, and, part of the community, general public just hasn't.
I also want to bring up an intersectional angle. Jen mentioned the importance of, understanding different cultures. Like, there's our American history, right? But so many folks who come, here, including myself, are immigrants, and we may not actually have this rich history of, disability. I don't think it's taught in schools. I don't think I was taught it until I came to University of Washington. So it is kind of, we can assume that probably quite a few people are coming from different cultural backgrounds and different even historical backgrounds when it comes to disability. So yeah, finding some way to educate in a convenient way would be very cool.
I was kind of looking forward to talking about women suffragettes, right, in part 2. So we'll have to go ahead and reschedule that. Susan, I'll put that over on to you. But, we're leaning in towards the end of the show, kind of like, the last 8 minutes. Let's maybe go around the horn. And I'll start with you, Jennifer.
Well, we've got a couple of comments in the chat first.
Okay, go ahead.
So, Kate has said, thanks for the answers, but also asked, is there a plain language disability 101 with key terms? And I don't know if you know the answer to that one, Jennifer, but I do.
Please answer.
So there's this group called SABE, SABE, Self Advocates Becoming Empowered. And they actually have classes that they do periodically, geared to different populations. They'll have plain text for CEOs, plain language for CEOs, plain language for service providers. They do different sort of orientations, and they are run by people who need plain language. So they're very interesting classes. I've taken a couple of them, and I highly recommend them. But that's through SABE, SABE. And then Alice has put in that she's working on writing for kids. The book that comes to mind about disability is the one written by Emily Ladau. She just wrote, and she's actually just came out with a new book. I haven't gotten it yet, and I should. I knew Emily before she had ever written her first blog post. And I was blogging at that point, although we didn't call it blogging at that point. And she wrote, I can remember still, she wrote to me and she said, "Do you think I could blog?" And she said, I'm just a girl in a wheelchair and I don't know what I would talk about." And I said, talk about being in a wheelchair. And so she's been doing a blog for years called The Wheels I Roll By.
Wow.
And she came out with her first book, and I haven't read it, but knowing her blog, I highly recommend it. And that's Emily Ladau, Ladeau.
And the book is called Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally.
Mm.
So that sounds pretty close, Kate.
I just put the link in the chat for anyone who needs it.
I was
Do you
going
know
to
her
comment.
personally, Susan? Emily Latto? Do you know her?
I'm sorry, could somebody say that title again? Because I just did not get the title of the book.
Sorry. It's called Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally.
Thank you.
And my question to the group was, does somebody know her personally? Or is this just a well-known book that you all refer to?
Emily, I think Alice, do you know Emily?
I
think you
don't know
do.
her personally, but I've been a lot of her work over the last several years. She is one of those young activists and has been doing a lot of work in the space. She does have a plain language version, as does Judy Human's memoir, which has a different name, and Alice Wong's memoir. Several people who have written their memoirs have put them into plain language for younger middle grade readers. So that,
Or adults with significant disabilities.
right. And she is well known in the community.
Yes. Yeah, she's actually working with the Northwest Disability Rights Coalition. I think it's the state of Washington's Disability Rights Coalition. So we've got some folks that have been quiet, and I'm wondering if any of them would like to have the opportunity to say something.
I'm wondering if
Jesse, you usually have something to say. You got any closing words?
Mallory has a hand up.
Okay.
Mallory, you're on mute still.
So Linda, what about you? You've
Hi.
unmuted yourself several times and then not said anything. Have you got something you want to?
Mallory's got the hand up and she's
Hi,
got.
this is Mallory.
Hi, Mallory.
I just thought I'd chip in on a little of the talking about what we're actively doing to try to help disability community learn about disability. And I've been working on a set of paintings of great disabled scholars, artists, activists, and the like to potentially maybe put together a card set of kind of the disabled people, of who's to know and what a little bit about them. So I thought I'd just share about that. It's in progress. So I'm actively seeking potential people I need to add to the list.
Can you put your contact information in the chat,
Oh, sure.
please? And I see
One
you're
of the
also the editor of the newsletter for Viscardi Center. Did not know that.
I'm the editor of what?
Well, Sharon just posted, oh, maybe it's someone else, that Emily is also the editor of the Viscardi Center's newsletter.
That makes more sense. I'm not the editor.
Yeah, not you. I read it wrong first.
I'm the dyslexic one that needs all the assistive technology to read what everybody's written about, and access scholarship is hard.
We're working on a project with the Arizona Women's History Alliance, and we're gamifying the concept of their Arizona suffrage timeline. And then they're also identifying the top 10. We're gamifying their inductees that went into their Hall of Fame. So just understanding who they are and matching them to their cause. But then also they'll be identifying who are the top 10 historic women to know. I mean, so those are like the things that if you could pull out, I mean, we're happy to help, gamify and earn badges and, challenge people to go consume that content so that they're standing on the other side of, hey, I actually have a ADA basic, Justin Dart badge set. I know who does it, or something like that.
Yeah.
Final thoughts coming around. I saw Kate, did you come in and wanted to say something on stage?
Oh, I didn't really want to give any final thoughts, but just thank you all so much for sharing all these interesting resources. And Jen did a very nice talk, very, very positive and future looking. It was a lot of fun. So thank you.
We are working diligently on trying to up and get our site up to where it's get the gold level seal of approval from all my experts here. And concurrently, we're building out this academy. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab all these things and we'll put it over there. So at least there's one place that it will sit as we kind of build this out on behalf of Lead On. But Susan, final thoughts as we wrap this up?
I'm just really glad those of you who got here, especially knowing that there was a major event going on that was competing for attention, although I don't think it actually took place. And I hope you guys will come back next month. I've got all kinds of exciting people who are coming each month, and every month is a different kind of topic. Usually there'll be two people. One person will focus on sort of the structure of disability studies in some fashion or another, and the other person will focus on history. And I wish I could tell you who we were having in September, but it is, well, one of them is actually, it's Anthony Tussler is coming. And I don't know how many of you know Anthony, but he's this at this point, very sweet old man that I've known for a very long time. And he is always the life of the party because he knows every piece of music that has any kind of disability influence in it whatsoever. And he will either sing them for you or he'll have them on his phone ready to play them. And you can hit him with, know any music that has this disability in it or that disability in it. He'll pull something up, and all kinds of genres of music. He's an amazing guy. He's a musical historian and a photographer. So he is he's one of my favorite people actually to have a conversation with because he is so entertaining. So come back for that. You won't regret it.
And just to add a point, he also was one of the pioneers of disability study communities in Sonoma State University, setting up a disability history archive way back in the 70s after the 504, which he was a photographer with Kenneth Stein, documenting the 504 1977. So yes, he will be very entertaining.
Okay, well, great. So everybody, thank you for joining us, and heads up for some more information. You could always go to iloveyouleadon.com/Devva for upcoming shows. And that QR code, if you screenshotted it, would take you to that site as well. So thanks for joining. Have a wonderful August, and reach out to Susan if you have any questions, okay?